There is a kind of financial anxiety that is different from panic. It does not arrive suddenly. It does not announce itself with a crisis or a single difficult day. It arrives gradually, the way a room slowly darkens in the late afternoon. You do not notice the exact moment when the light began to fail. Many people describe it as a quiet nagging feeling, a sense that the numbers never quite add up the way they were supposed to. That the life they imagined at 30 or 40, comfortable, stable, earned through honest work, turned out to be slightly more expensive, slightly less predictable, and slightly harder to hold onto than they expected. They did not expect wealth. That is not what this is about. What they expected was security. They expected that if they worked steadily for 30 or 40 years, if they saved what they could, if they kept their expenses sensible and their expectations modest, they would arrive somewhere solid. They would have a home they owned, a pension or savings that covered the basics, a retirement that was not luxurious but was not frightening either. They expected the deal to hold. For many of them, it did not hold. Not completely, not the way they thought it would. And what is strange, what many people only begin to articulate late in life, if at all, is that they are not entirely sure what went wrong. They look back at their choices. They examine their decisions. They wonder, sometimes late at night, whether they did something incorrect. Whether they missed something obvious. Whether they should have worked harder, saved differently, chosen a different path. But most of them did not do anything obviously wrong. Most of them followed the instructions they were given. They showed up. They paid their bills. They tried to be responsible. And somewhere in the years between hope and arrival, the rules quietly changed. This is the story of the middle class, not just as an economic category on a chart, but as a lived experience. As a promise made and then gradually, almost invisibly, unmade. It is a story worth understanding clearly, not with bitterness, not with nostalgia for a past that was never quite as simple as it seems from here, but with the kind of honest attention that complicated things deserve. Because for millions of people, the confusion they feel about their financial lives is not a sign of weakness or ignorance. It is a rational response to a system that shifted while they were living in it. Today we are going to look at what the middle class was. What it promised. What actually happened to that promise over the last 50 years. And what it means to live with that knowledge, not with false optimism, and not with despair, but with the clarity that only comes when you finally see the situation as it actually is. The middle class, in the decades after the Second World War, was not just a salary range. It was an experience, a particular way that ordinary life felt. A young couple marrying in the early 1960s would have held a set of reasonable assumptions that were, for a certain period in a certain part of the world, largely accurate. Work was available. Work paid enough to live on. Rents were manageable. A house was expensive but reachable. Employers offered something resembling loyalty in exchange for decades of service. Medicine did not bankrupt you. Children were expensive but manageable. Old age would be hard, but the hardship was shared. A pension from the company, social insurance from the government, the accumulated savings from a lifetime of modest thrift. That picture was never universal. There were always people outside it. People locked out by race, by geography, by circumstance, by systems that did not include them in the promise at all. That history matters and should not be erased. But for a broad portion of working people, in the 2 or 3 decades after the war, the promise was real enough to build a life on. And then, gradually, it began to hollow out. Not in 1 year, not because of one decision, but through a series of structural shifts, each of which seemed manageable at the time, that together moved the foundation under people's feet without most of them ever hearing a single warning. The people who grew up in that era of relative stability often describe it in terms that sound almost foreign now. A father who worked one job and supported a family. A neighborhood where the doctor was in roughly the same economic position as the factory foreman. A sense that tomorrow would be roughly as predictable as today. A confidence, quiet, unexamined, never questioned because it had never been shaken, that the future was reachable. Many of their children and grandchildren have spent decades trying to reconstruct that feeling. And many of them have found that no matter how hard they try, something is missing. The architecture of daily life no longer fits together the same way it once did. That is not an accident, and it is not personal failure. To understand what happened, you have to go back to the early 1970s. That decade gets talked about a great deal: the oil shocks, the inflation, the political turbulence. But what matters here is something more structural, and in some ways quieter than any of those events. For roughly 25 years after the war, wages grew at almost exactly the same pace as productivity. In plain language, when workers produced more, they earned more. The gains of a growing economy were distributed broadly enough that ordinary workers participated in them. That is what made the middle class feel, for a generation, like a reasonable destination rather than a lucky outcome. Around the early 1970s, those two lines, productivity and wages, began to diverge. Productivity continued to rise. Wages began to stagnate. The economy kept growing, but the people doing the work increasingly stopped sharing in the growth. This divergence has been measured and documented by multiple economists and research organizations. It is not a partisan claim. It is one of the most thoroughly established facts in recent economic history. The reasons for it are genuinely complex. Globalization changed where goods were made and shifted bargaining power away from domestic workers. Automation slowly reduced the leverage of physical labor. Union membership declined through the 1970s and 1980s, removing a force that had helped wages track productivity for decades. Capital became more mobile. The financial sector grew relative to manufacturing. The relationship between an employer and a worker shifted in ways that felt, at first, like efficiency, and revealed themselves over time as something else. None of these changes were invisible exactly. Economists wrote about them, journalists covered them, but the effects arrived slowly enough that most people experienced them not as a system-level crisis but as a personal puzzle. A promotion that should have come and did not. A raise that lagged inflation by a percentage point or two for a year, and then another year. A sense that working harder produced diminishing returns, without any clear explanation of why. At the same time, the structure of employment was changing in a way that is now so familiar it is hard to remember when it was different. For most of the post-war decades, a large employer meant a defined benefit pension. You worked for 30 or 35 years, you retired, and the company, sometimes alongside the government, paid you a monthly amount for the rest of your life. That payment was a promise. It was backed by your years of service. It did not depend on stock market performance or on your personal investment decisions or on whether you had made the right choices at 35. It was, in the most basic sense, insurance against outliving your income. Beginning in the late 1970s and accelerating through the 1980s and 1990s, that promise was replaced by something structurally different. The 401k account and its equivalents turned retirement saving into a personal project. Employers still contributed, in many cases. But the risk shifted. If the market fell in the years before you retired, that was your problem, not the company's. If you made poor investment decisions, or if life intervened and you could not save consistently, you arrived at retirement with less. The floor was not removed all at once, but it was gradually lifted away, quietly, in the paperwork of plan conversions that most workers signed without fully understanding what they were giving up. This shift was often presented as liberation, more freedom, more personal control, more flexibility. For high earners who could maximize contributions and ride decades of market growth, it sometimes was. For most ordinary workers, the shift transferred risk onto people who had fewer tools to manage it and less margin for error if it went wrong. Housing followed a similar trajectory. In the early post-war decades, a median home cost roughly 2 to 3 times the median annual household income. It was a stretch, but a manageable one that a working family could close with a consistent savings habit and a reasonable mortgage. Through the following decades, that ratio climbed to 4 times annual income, to 5, to 6 or more in many cities and metropolitan areas. The mortgage became a heavier burden relative to earnings. The down payment became harder to accumulate. The home, which had been sold to an entire generation as the cornerstone of middle-class wealth, became simultaneously less affordable and more necessary. And then there is healthcare. Medical care went from a modest and relatively predictable expense to one of the largest and least controllable items in a household budget. Insurance premiums rose for decades. Deductibles rose. The gap between what insurance covered and what care actually cost continued to widen. A serious illness, even for someone with coverage, could mean thousands of dollars in out-of-pocket costs at exactly the moment when a family was least equipped to absorb them. For people approaching retirement, the prospect of managing healthcare costs without employer-sponsored coverage became one of the central sources of financial anxiety, a fear that had barely registered as a concern for the generation before them. Each of these changes, taken alone, could be absorbed by a resilient household. Together, across decades, they changed what a working life produced at its end. The same years of work, the same level of effort, the same responsible behavior that had once built reliable middle-class security now produced something considerably less certain. The arithmetic had changed. The deal that a previous generation had made, work hard, live modestly, trust the institutions, no longer returned what it once had. And most of the people living through this had no language for it. They knew something felt wrong. They did not always know what to call it. The statistics are one thing. The lived experience is another. Consider what it actually felt like, from the inside, to inhabit these changes as they happened. In the 1970s, a family in which one parent worked a steady manufacturing or clerical job was not unusual. Not privileged, just ordinary. The single income was not easy, but it covered rent, groceries, school expenses, the occasional car repair, and enough left over at the end of the month to save something small and feel the slight reassurance of it. Not comfort exactly, but predictability, the sense that next month would look roughly like this month. By the 1980s, that picture was beginning to shift. More households became two-income households, sometimes by choice, more often by necessity. The second income stopped being optional. It became the only way to maintain the standard of living one income had once sustained. This change was absorbed quietly by families who understood it as normal, as what modern life looked like. And in some ways, it was. But it was also something else. A doubling of economic effort to stay in roughly the same place. Two incomes arrived, and housing prices absorbed them. Two incomes arrived, and childcare costs absorbed them. The new baseline required more from people and returned, in many cases, less security than the old one had. The goal line had moved, and nobody had announced it moving. The generation that came of age in the 1980s and 1990s inherited this reconfigured baseline. They entered a job market that was different from their parents'. Employers were more willing to hire contractors than full-time employees. Benefits that had once been standard, health insurance, retirement contributions, paid leave, began to vary widely, to shrink, or to disappear from the lower rungs of the labor market. The idea of working for the same company for 30 years began to seem less like wisdom and more like a relic. Job hopping, which had once carried a slight stigma, became something employers tacitly expected. In the middle of all this, debt arrived and grew comfortable. Student loans became larger, more normalized, and less obviously tethered to the income they were supposed to produce. Credit became easier to access and more necessary to manage the gap between what people earned and what ordinary life cost. The mortgage on the modest house arrived at a higher multiple of income and with terms that pushed the payoff further into old age. The financial calendar stretched. What makes this story particularly difficult to discuss clearly is that the people living through it rarely experienced it as a single coherent crisis. They experienced it as a series of adjustments. A year in which the savings account did not grow as planned. A medical bill that reset the financial calendar. A layoff that was survived but that changed the arc of a career. A pension that turned out to be smaller than projected, or that was reduced when the company restructured, or that did not exist at all because the job that offered it ended before the vesting period closed. Think of someone who spent 40 years doing everything they were supposed to do. They paid into their pension system for decades. They contributed what they could to a retirement account, though the amounts were sometimes smaller than the financial planning articles recommended because life intervened in the specific ways it always does. They owned a home, or tried to, and managed its costs through good years and difficult ones. They raised children. They stayed as healthy as they could and tried not to let medical bills accumulate. And now, at 65 or 70, they find themselves calculating not whether they can be comfortable but whether they can be safe. The anxiety they feel is not irrational. It is not the result of careless choices. It is the predictable outcome of decades of structural shift, experienced as personal uncertainty. And one of the most difficult aspects of this story is that the people living it often do not quite believe their own situation is not their fault. They were raised in a culture that attributed financial outcomes almost entirely to personal behavior. Work hard enough and you will succeed. Save carefully enough and you will be fine. Make the right choices and the system will reward you. That belief served a purpose for generations. It motivated people, gave them a sense of agency, made responsibility feel meaningful. But it also left them, when the system did not deliver what it had seemed to promise, with nowhere to put the confusion except inward. They wondered what they did wrong. They compared themselves to the few who seemed to have arrived comfortably and searched for the decision they must have missed. They felt, often without quite admitting it to themselves or to anyone else, a low-grade shame about the gap between what they expected and what they had. That shame is not deserved. It is, in many cases, a distraction from the actual explanation. It is worth asking a harder question than just what happened to the money. The middle class was never only about income. That is what makes its decline difficult to understand from the outside, and difficult to grieve from the inside. It was about something harder to measure and harder to replace. It was about a particular feeling in daily life. The feeling that the future was, broadly speaking, manageable. That effort connected reliably to outcome. That institutions, employers, governments, banks, healthcare systems, were playing by recognizable rules and would more or less honor the contracts they had made. That children had a reasonable chance of inheriting at least the material stability their parents had worked to create. That feeling is not simply comfort. It is one of the psychological foundations of a functioning adult life. Researchers who study financial stress note that it is not the absolute level of income that most powerfully shapes well-being. It is the sense of control and predictability. A person earning a modest but stable income often reports greater peace of mind than someone earning considerably more from uncertain sources. What people need, at a deep level, is not wealth. It is the sense that tomorrow will be roughly interpretable. The middle class, at its most functional, provided that interpretability. It was a social arrangement that translated effort into outcome with enough consistency that people could plan. They could make decisions about education, housing, family size, and retirement on the basis of reasonable expectations about what those decisions would produce. The plan might not unfold exactly as drawn. Life never does. But the basic logic of it would hold. When that logic stopped holding reliably, something more than money was lost. Trust eroded, not just trust in specific institutions, though that happened too, but a more diffuse trust in the logic of the social contract itself. The contract that said, participate, contribute, follow the rules, and you will receive in return a life that is not luxurious but is secure. A life in which the connection between effort and outcome makes enough sense to be worth the effort. The anger that has accumulated in working and middle-class communities over the last several decades is often explained in cultural or political terms. It is attributed to changing demographics, to media influence, to the particular grievances of particular groups. And those explanations are not without truth. But underneath a great deal of that anger is something more specific and more personal. The experience of having followed the rules and found the promised outcome missing. The experience of doing the responsible things and still losing ground. The experience of a deal that turned out not to mean what it appeared to say. That experience does not automatically produce insight. It can produce blame, resentment, withdrawal, or something darker just as easily. History shows that when people feel the social contract has been violated, they do not always respond with clear analysis. They respond with the emotions that arrive first, and often those emotions attach themselves to whatever target is nearest and most visible. Understanding those emotions clearly, not dismissing them, not amplifying them, requires seeing the structural reality behind them. Here is what that structural reality looks like, stated plainly. For several decades, the gains of economic growth were distributed more and more narrowly. The median worker's real wage grew very little over the last 50 years, even as the overall economy expanded enormously. The people who owned capital did significantly better than the people who provided labor. Productivity gains did not translate into wage gains at the rate they once had. The mechanisms that had distributed prosperity broadly, collective bargaining, defined benefit pensions, public investment in housing and education, a tax structure that funded shared institutions, were either weakened or redirected. This is not a claim that belongs to one side of a political argument. It is a measurable pattern, documented by researchers across different orientations. The disagreements are about causes and remedies, which are genuinely complicated questions. The basic pattern itself is not seriously contested. What is striking is how slowly this pattern entered ordinary conversation, and how rarely it entered it in the language people needed to understand their own lives. People felt it for decades before they had the framework to describe it. They felt it as private inadequacy, as the nagging sense that they had missed something, as the quiet confusion of working harder and arriving somewhere smaller than they had been led to expect. And here is what that costs beyond the financial numbers. When people lose confidence in the connection between effort and reward, they lose something essential to the way a human life is organized. If hard work no longer reliably produces security, what is the point of hard work? That question, unspoken, half-formed, perhaps never consciously articulated, erodes something at the center of how people understand themselves and their place in the world. It makes delayed gratification feel less rational. It makes the kind of long-term planning that a stable middle-class life requires feel increasingly like a form of self-deception. The social costs of this erosion are real but diffuse. They show up in the data on civic trust, on institutional confidence, on health outcomes in communities that once expected a reliable future and now navigate a much more uncertain one. They show up in the particular quality of exhaustion that many people carry in the second half of their lives, not just the physical exhaustion of age but the psychological exhaustion of decades of recalculation, adaptation, and quiet disappointment absorbed without acknowledgement. And yet, the experience of living through this with dignity, continuing to manage, to adapt, to care for the people around you, to maintain some sense of integrity in the face of outcomes that seem unfair, is not a small thing. It is, in a certain light, a remarkable thing. The people who kept going, who stayed responsible under conditions that did not always reward responsibility, who continued to love their families and tend their relationships and honor their commitments without the material security those commitments seemed to deserve, those people were not failures. They were navigating something genuinely difficult, with fewer tools and less acknowledgement than the difficulty warranted. Naming the structural reality does not solve it, but it does something important. It places the weight of it in the right place. Not on the individual who did not save enough in the years when saving was nearly impossible. Not on the family that made imperfect choices in conditions that were not designed to make good choices easy. On the systems and structures that, over decades, shifted the terms of the deal, and did so without announcement, without apology, and largely without consequence for the people who made the decisions. There is a kind of clarity that only comes when you stop trying to make sense of something by blaming yourself. It does not arrive all at once. It arrives when you have sat with the confusion long enough, when you have gone over the choices you made, the chances you took, the things you wish you had done differently, and you finally begin to suspect that the story is larger than your personal decisions. That you were not the only actor in it. That the stage was set in ways you did not choose. The middle class, as a lived experience, was a product of a particular historical moment. It required a particular set of conditions, economic, social, institutional, to function. Those conditions existed more fully in some decades than others. They were more available to some groups of people than others. And over the last 50 years, they have become less reliable for a broad portion of ordinary working families. That is not a comfortable thing to say. It does not produce easy answers or a list of steps to take. Understanding the structural causes of a difficult situation is not the same as solving it. But understanding is still worth something. Specifically, it is worth this. It allows you to stop carrying shame for outcomes that were shaped by forces much larger than your own choices. Many people who grew up in the era of middle-class expectation and found the reality disappointing have carried a quiet background feeling of having failed. Of having missed something that more disciplined, more careful, more fortunate people around them managed to find. The comfortable retirement, the paid-off home, the savings that would hold, these things seemed reachable, and then they seemed slightly further, and then they seemed to belong to a different category of person than the one you had turned out to be. For some people, in some circumstances, personal decisions were genuinely the difference. Financial choices matter. Discipline matters. Knowledge matters. None of that is untrue. But the structural changes we have been describing are also real, and their effects were not distributed equally across people of equal effort or equal virtue. Wage stagnation is real. The shift from pensions to individual accounts is real. The housing affordability gap is real. The transfer of economic risk from institutions onto individuals is real. These forces did not make good decisions pointless. But they fundamentally changed what was possible for working people making ordinary choices, and that change happened largely outside the sphere of any individual's control. The reasonable response to understanding this is not despair. It is not outrage, though outrage would be understandable. It is something quieter and ultimately more useful. It is the ability to see your own financial life, and the financial lives of the people around you, with something closer to accuracy. Without the distortions of false self-blame. Without the exhausting effort of pretending the rules have not changed. The world did not change fairly. The terms were shifted, often without announcement. The contracts were rewritten in language that most people had no reason to examine closely until the outcome was already upon them. And the people living with the consequences were largely told, by culture, by financial advice columns, by the quiet assumptions of the institutions around them, that the consequences were primarily the result of personal choices. Perhaps the most useful thing is simply to stop believing that version of events, not because personal responsibility is meaningless, but because false blame makes it harder to see clearly. It makes it harder to understand what is actually happening and what might actually be done about it. It makes it harder to feel solidarity with the people around you who are navigating the same conditions. And it makes it harder to live with the dignity that an honest understanding of a difficult situation makes possible. The middle class was a real thing. It mattered. It created, for enough people, for long enough, a life that felt manageable and worth the effort. Its erosion has left a real absence, in household accounts, in retirement projections, in the daily arithmetic of ordinary families who work hard and find the numbers still do not quite add up. That absence is worth naming, not with anger and not with resignation, but with the calm, honest attention that difficult truths deserve, because seeing clearly is always, in the end, more useful than the comfort of a story that was never quite true.